Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of the Barefoot Genealogist. Today's presentation is going to be short and sweet. It actually is being pre-recorded today because I am on a plane on my way to Boston during our regularly scheduled 1 p.m. Eastern 10 a.m. Pacific time for live airing. We're doing an Ancestry Day in Boston in conjunction with NEHGS. And if you live in the area, I would encourage you to check that out. If you have a Pinterest account, or even if you don't, you can go look at the Ancestry.com Pinterest account and see a list of all of our events so that you can participate in any event that may happen as we travel around the country. So, today's presentation is going to be short and sweet, and it's actually kind of a part two. So, on Tuesday, we spoke about finding your early 20th century immigrant ancestors. And the tips and tricks that I shared then are just as applicable as they are for the late 19th century immigrants. So I'm just going to review a few of those things, but I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to take the time to go and watch that video. When we upload this to YouTube, I'll make sure that that gets put in the description so you can link directly to it. So the first piece of advice, of course, is to start with the census. Doesn't matter whether your ancestor came in 1860 or 1920. Those census records from 1900 to 1930 contain information about immigration, naturalization, and the birthplaces of those children. So if your ancestor came in, the late 1800s, look for those early 1900 censuses to give you a sense of when they came to the United States. Now, one of the challenges is that once you get 20 or 30 or 40 years away from an event, sometimes the exact year becomes a little bit imprecise. So make sure that you collect every one of those census records where possible, and so that you have a range of immigration years and hopefully can narrow it down that way. Also, we talked about naturalization status. Pay attention to that. Look for those naturalization papers if they became a U.S. citizen. Those naturalization papers are a treasure trove of information. It is a complete packet. It includes a declaration of intent, as well as a petition for naturalization. And those documents oftentimes contain information about the exact date, port, and ship of arrival for that particular immigrant. Included in that then are usually the spouse and children of the immigrant as well, which means that you probably won't be looking for naturalization paperwork for married women. Before 1920, women derived their citizenship status from their husband. So if their husband was not a citizen, they were not a citizen. If their husband was a citizen, they became a citizen by nature of his naturalization, or just even by nature of his citizenship. So if a foreign-born woman married a U.S. citizen, she was also granted citizenship. So women typically in that time period are not going to have naturalization paperwork, but their husbands, if they were foreign-born and became citizens, would, and it would include that information about the spouse and children. So be sure to look for that paperwork. We do have naturalization records online for anything that the National Archives held. We've digitized those and put those online. Sometimes it's an original, sometimes it's just an index card, which means you'll need to go to the National Archives to get a copy of that original packet. Now, let's talk specifically about some tips for those late 19th century immigrant ancestors. There are some variability in the way that their naturalization or that their immigration was recorded, and so we want to make sure that we know how to find them. One of the first tips that I would give you is look for that first census after they arrive in the United States. So for example, if you have an ancestor who arrived from Ireland in 1878, look at that 1880 census. Pay really close attention to who else is living in the household, but also pay close attention to those neighbors. Oftentimes, if you can't find your ancestor on the passenger list, they may have immigrated with friends, family, neighbors from their hometown or home village in Europe somewhere. And so if you search for some of those neighbors, you can sometimes get lucky and find that. I've had a couple of really great successes by doing that. Another tip, and this is especially, there was a lot of Irish immigration in the late 1800s. And one of the challenges with Irish research is common names. I have a great grandfather whose name was John O'Brien, and I can't even begin to tell you how many of them I filter through all the time looking for more information for him. And so one of those differentiating pieces of information is going to be their occupation. So pay attention to what their occupation is listed on the census as. Maybe look for them also in city directories. So if, for example, if they came in 1872 or 1892 or 1887, right, you've got a big gap there between the time they immigrated and the time that that first census was taken. And so you need to use city directories. And city directories will often list, again, address. You can search the city directories by address to see who else they might be living with or near. It'll also list occupation many times. So use that piece of information so that when you find a passenger list, you can tell who your person is. Now, one of the challenges with these passenger lists in the late 1800s, this is a New York passenger list from 1878, is that it provides very, very, very limited information. So for example, it has here a name, an age, a gender, and then some kind of an occupation. Now, in some cases, that occupation is really vague. I think on this page there's a whole list of laborers, but that will help you differentiate between your ancestor who may have had a trade as opposed to being just a laborer. It'll list their birthplace, where they're headed, and then what class of passage they were brought over as. So again, really, really limited information on these late 1800 passenger lists. So the more information you can collect about them in the United States, who they associated with, what they did for a living, it's going to help you differentiate between your John O'Brien and the hundreds of other John O'Briens that may have immigrated in a 20-year span, between your Mary Ford and the dozens of other Mary Fords that may have come between 1875 and 1880. So use that occupation field. The other thing that I'm just going to encourage you to do is to think about the age at immigration. Sometimes we don't do the math. So for example, if your ancestor was born in 1858 and they immigrated to the United States in 1863, they would have only been 5 years old. That's significant because it means that they likely came with family. It could have been a father and a mother. It could have been just the mother. It could have been an older teenage sibling or an aunt, but they likely did not come alone if they were a young child. So do the math to figure out how old they would have been. Now, with that said, young teenagers sometimes immigrated alone or with an older teenage sibling. And so think about that as well. Do as much as you can to reconstruct the family after they arrive in the United States. Look for those census records. If the only records you have for your ancestor are after they became an adult, track down their death records. See if you can find an obituary that might list the names of siblings, a death certificate that would list the names of parents. Anything you can do to reconstruct information about that person's family, again, will help you know if you've got the right person when you do finally find them on that passenger list. So do the math. Figure out how old they were when they immigrated. If they were under 10 or 12 years old, you can start to assume or make some assumptions around the fact that they likely immigrated with a parent. If they're over the age of 10 or 12 years old, it's very possible that they immigrated alone or with an older sibling. So the more you can find out about those family members, the more likely you are to key in on that correct passenger list. Well, I said we were going to be short and sweet today. As I mentioned earlier, I do encourage you to go and watch the video from Tuesday. Even though we were talking about early 20th century immigration, I walked through those first tips and tricks I shared about looking at the census to determine immigration and naturalization status, and about how to find those naturalization documents. And I would encourage you to spend a lot of time with that. Sometimes when we're in passenger lists, it can feel like we're filtering through dozens and dozens and dozens of people, and how do we know we've found our person? So the more information as I said, you can get here in the United States, the better. That is all we have time for today. I've actually got to go catch an airplane to head to Boston so that I can present at our Ancestry Day with NEHGS. I would encourage you, as I said earlier, to go check out our Pinterest page. We have a board for genealogy conferences, and from there you can see where I will be traveling around the country for the remainder of the year, and maybe you can join me at one of those events. I would love to meet you. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.